the valley of fear, a long time ago, in the land of Israel, two mighty armies stood on opposite hills, facing a deep valley in between. On one hill stood the army of Israel, tired, nervous, and quiet. On the other stood the Philistines, loud, bold, and full of pride. The valley between them was dry and dusty, the kind of place where fear could grow like weeds in the silence. Every morning, as the sun rose over the hills, the silence would be broken by the sound of heavy footsteps. Boom! Boom! A shadow moved across the valley floor, long and terrible. It was Goliath, the Philistines' champion, a warrior so big, so strong, that he looked more like a monster than a man. Goliath stood over 9 feet tall. His armor was made of bronze and glittered in the sunlight like fire. His spear was as thick as a weaver's beam, and his sword looked like it could cut down a tree. But worst of all was his voice. "Is there nitrogen monoxide? One brave enough to fight me?" he roared. "Send me your best man. If he defeats me, we Philistines will serve you. But if I win, you will be our slaves." The Israelites trembled. Every day, for 40 days, Goliath came down into the valley and shouted this challenge. And every day, not a single soldier stepped forward. Even King Saul, who stood tallest among the Israelites, stayed in his tent, biting his nails and avoiding the eyes of his men. Far from the battlefield, in a small town called Bethlehem, there lived a boy named David. He was the youngest of 8 brothers and spent most of his time watching over his family's sheep. David wasn't a soldier. He wasn't tall or strong or trained with weapons. But David had something else, a heart that burned with courage and a soul that trusted in God. David loved being a shepherd. He knew each of his sheep by name. When they wandered off, he found them. When lions or bears came near, David fought them off with only a sling and a stick. Most boys would have run away. Not David. He believed that God was always with him, even out in the wild fields. One day, David's father, Jesse, called him in from the pasture. "Take this food to your brothers who are fighting in King Saul's army," he said, handing David a sack of bread, cheese, and roasted grain. "And find out how they're doing." David woke early the next morning, left the sheep with a helper, and began the long walk to the battlefield. He had never seen a war before, but his heart beat with excitement. Maybe he'd hear stories from his older brothers Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, who were strong and brave. Maybe he'd even see the king himself. When David reached the camp, soldiers were getting into formation. Drums thudded in the distance. Trumpets bled. He ran to the supply area, left the food, and hurried to the front lines to find his brothers. But just as he reached them, a terrible sound echoed across the valley. "Israel, I dare you. Send someone to face me." David froze. He looked across the valley and saw the giants stomping forward. Soldiers backed away. Even his brothers avoided looking. David's eyes widened. "Who is that?" he asked. "That's Goliath," someone whispered. "He comes every morning and every night. No one dares fight him." David's eyebrows furrowed. "But why not? He's insulting our people and our God." His oldest brother Eliab turned to him angrily. "What are you doing here, David? Shouldn't you be watching sheep? I brought food, and I wanted to see how you were," David replied, confused by the anger. "But this isn't right. We can't just let him say these things." Word began to spread the shepherd boy is talking about fighting Goliath. Soldiers laughed. Some rolled their eyes, but others grew curious. Could it be possible? Could someone actually take a stand? Eventually, the whispers reached King Saul himself. "There's a boy who says he's willing to fight," someone told him. "A boy," Saul frowned. "Bring him to me." And so, David was led to the king's tent, still dusty from travel, still smelling like sheep, and still holding the courage of someone who knew his strength didn't come from himself, but from God. King Saul sat in his tent, head resting on one hand, when the guards brought in a boy young sunburned and full of confidence. It was David. He didn't look like a warrior. He didn't sound like a warrior. But when he spoke, something about him made even the king stop and listen. "Don't let anyone lose heart because of that Philistine," David said boldly. "I'll go and fight him." Saul blinked in disbelief. "You," he said, "you're just a boy. Goliath has been fighting since he was your age. He's a trained killer. You're a shepherd." David stood tall. "I may not be a soldier, but I've fought lions and bears to protect my sheep. When one of them took a lamb, I chased it down, struck it, and rescued it. If God protected me from lions and bears, he'll protect me from this giant too." For a moment, King Saul just stared. The boy wasn't bluffing. He truly believed what he was saying. "All right," Saul finally said, "go, and may the Lord be with you." Then, as any king would do, Saul tried to give David some help. He took his own royal armor and handed it over: bronze helmet, chainmail coat, sword, and shield. It was all far too big. The helmet slipped over David's eye. The chest plate nearly dragged on the ground. When David tried to walk, he stumbled like a child in grown-up shoes. "I can't wear this," David said with a laugh, removing each piece. "I'm not used to it." Instead, he picked up what he knew. He reached into his bag and pulled out his sling, a long leather strip with a pouch in the middle. Then he walked down to the nearby stream and selected 5 smooth stones, placing them carefully in his pouch. That was all he needed. Not armor, not a sword, just his sling, his faith, and his courage. As David stepped onto the battlefield, the army of Israel held its breath. Could this really be happening? A boy facing a giant? On the other hill, the Philistines began to laugh. Goliath spotted David coming and squinted down at him. "What is this?" he bellowed. "A boy with sticks. Do you think I'm a dog?" He laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. It was full of hate. "Come here, little one. I'll feed you to the birds." But David didn't flinch. He took a few more steps and shouted back, "You come to me with a sword and a spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, whom you have insulted." Goliath raised his eyebrow. David continued, louder now, so that both armies could hear. "Today, the Lord will give you into my hands. I'll strike you down, and everyone here will know it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle belongs to God." There was a hush across the valley. Then boom! Goliath began to charge. His armor clanked with every step. His footsteps shook the ground. His eyes were locked on David like a hawk watching its prey. But David didn't back away. He ran straight toward the giant. While he ran, he reached into his pouch, pulled out a smooth stone, placed it in the sling, and began to spin it over his head. Once, twice, 3 times. Thwack! The stone flew like lightning across the valley. It struck Goliath right between the eyes. The giant stopped mid-step. His knees wobbled. His eyes rolled. And then he fell face first. Dust rose in clouds as his body crashed to the ground. The earth shook beneath him. Dead silence, the Philistines froze. The Israelites stared. And then someone gasped. He did it. He actually did it! For a few long seconds, it felt like time had stopped in the valley. The giant Goliath, who had taunted armies, terrified soldiers, and laughed in the face of kings, was now lying flat on the ground, motionless, silent, defeated. And standing over him was a shepherd boy with a sling in one hand and no sword in the other. The soldiers of Israel watched from their hilltop, still frozen in disbelief. Could this really be? Was it possible that the loudest, strongest, scariest enemy had just been taken down by a kid? But David didn't hesitate. He ran forward toward the giant's fallen form. Goliath's massive sword still rested beside his body. With both hands, David pulled it from its sheath. It was almost too heavy for him to lift. And with one strong motion, he finished what he had promised. Goliath, the terror of Israel, was no more. The silence broke. It started as a gasp, then a roar, then 1,000 voices shouting across the hills. The giant is down. God has delivered us. David has won. On the Philistine side, panic erupted. The mighty army that had stood so proudly now dropped their weapons in fear. The one man they had trusted to defeat Israel had fallen, and they had no backup plan. Their champion was gone, and now they were running, sprinting away across the valley, tripping over each other in terror. King Saul, watching from his tent, stood slowly and looked at the battlefield. "Who is this boy?" he asked the commander beside him. "Whose son is he?" "I'm not sure," the man replied, eyes still wide in awe. "But I'll find out." The Israelite army didn't wait. Fueled by courage and hope, they let out a thunderous war cry and chased after the Philistines. What had started as fear became victory. What had begun with trembling knees now turned into bold, confident stride. Back on the battlefield, David stood quietly. He looked out at the valley where he had faced Goliath only moments before. His heart beat fast, not with fear, but with joy. Not with pride, but with... He whispered a prayer of thanks, his voice steady. "You, O Lord, gave me strength." Later that day, the battlefield cleared. David was brought before King Saul once again. He was no longer the little brother who delivered lunch. He was now Israel's hero. Saul looked at him closely. "Who are you, son?" David stood tall but humbly. "I am David, son of Jesse of Bethlehem." Saul smiled. "You are no ordinary shepherd." But David just smiled back. "I served no ordinary God." That night, the camp of Israel was filled with singing, laughter, and praise. Soldiers who had once trembled now danced around fires. Songs were sung not just about David, but about the God who gave him victory. And in the hearts of every person, young and old, coach was reborn. But back in Bethlehem, Jesse still hadn't heard what his youngest son had done. To him, David was probably still out delivering cheese and bread. Little did he know, the boy with the sling was now known across the land. The stars glittered above the Israelite camp that night, brighter than they had in weeks. For the first time in a long time, no one was afraid. Soldiers who once hid in tents now stood tall beside campfires, laughing and telling stories. All of them circled back to one person, David. They spoke of the stone that struck like lightning, of the moment Goliath's sword was raised not by the giant, but by a boy. They spoke of courage, and more than that, of the God who gave it. David sat quietly near the edge of camp, watching the firelight flicker. He wasn't trying to be the center of attention. In truth, he was still just the same shepherd who talked to his sheep, played his harp under the stars, and believed deeply that God was always near. But from that day forward, nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, King Saul summoned David again. This time, the tent was quiet. No laughter, no royal robes, just a king and a boy eye to eye. "You saved Israel," Saul said softly, "but I want to know more. What gave you the courage to face a giant?" David smiled. "I didn't see a giant. I saw someone who didn't know our God." Saul sat back, thoughtful. "And what will you do now?" "You're a hero, David. The people are singing your name." David looked down at his sling, still tucked into his belt. "I'll serve my king. I'll do whatever God wants. I'm still a shepherd, even if I don't carry sheep anymore." Saul stood, then placed a hand on David's shoulder. "Then stay in my court. Let me teach you. I see something in you." And just like that, the shepherd boy from Bethlehem became a servant in the palace. As the weeks passed, David didn't just serve Saul, he inspired the nation. He played music that soothed the king's troubled spirit. He led small groups of soldiers with unexpected bravery. The people began to whisper not only about his victory, but about his heart. "God is with him," they said, "not just in battle, but in everything." But not everyone was pleased. Some of the older soldiers, those who had worn armor for years, felt embarrassed that they hadn't stepped forward like David. Others, more quietly, began to worry. What if this boy grew too popular? What if the people began to love him more than their king? Even Saul began to feel uneasy. He had once been the tallest and strongest in Israel. he had once led with confidence. But now the songs of the people were changing. Saul has slain his thousands, but David is tens of thousands. Each time Saul heard those words, a shadow crossed his heart. Was this the boy who had helped him more? Someone who might someday take his place? But David didn't notice. He continued to serve, continued to obey, and continued to pray. He wasn't seeking power or fame. His heart still belonged to the hills of Bethlehem and the God he'd trusted beside quiet streams. One day, David returned home for a short visit. His father Jesse embraced him with joy. "My son, they say you stood before a giant and won." David chuckled. "God stood with me. I just did what I could." His brothers were quieter. They still remembered mocking him on the battlefield, and now the whole country sang his name. But David didn't hold a grudge. He greeted them with warmth. After all, he hadn't fought Goliath to prove anything. He had fought because someone had to stand up. That night, back among the sheep and the stars, David played his harp and sang softly. His voice echoed through the fields. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." The same boy, the same heart. But now the path before him would lead far beyond the hills of Bethlehem. The winds of change blew through Israel. David, the boy who once chased after lambs in the hills of Bethlehem, now walked through the royal courts. Where once he carried bread and cheese, he now carried a sword. Where once he played songs to sheep, he now played for a king. People loved David. Children pointed at him in the streets and whispered excitedly. Farmers spoke his name when they gathered at wells. In the marketplaces, women sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, but David has tens of thousands." To the people, it was just a joyful rhyme. To King Saul, it was something far darker. He heard it again and again, and each time, something inside him tightened. His smile faded. His chest but it wasn't just about a song, it was about power, respect, legacy. He had been chosen as Israel's first king. He had led battles, built armies, and worn the crown with pride. But now the whispers had changed. His throne no longer felt secure. One evening, as David played his harp in the palace, his fingers dancing across the strings, his music lifting the weight of the day, Saul watched from his throne, eyes shadowed. "How is it," he thought, "that the boy's music calms everyone, even me?" Then came the louder question in his heart. What if the people love him more than they love their king? And so, for the first time, the warmth in Saul's eyes began to fade when he looked at David. Where once he saw a faithful servant, he now saw a threat. But David, he had no idea. He was still the same boy, brave, humble, and full of faith. He obeyed the king, honored his family, and gave credit to God in all things. He wasn't trying to steal glory or rise above others. He simply did what he believed was right. One of Saul's sons, Jonathan, noticed this. Jonathan was a warrior himself, strong, skilled, and noble. But unlike his father, he wasn't jealous. He saw something rare in David, a pure heart, and soon the two became the closest of friends. Jonathan gave David his own royal robe, belt, and even his sword, a powerful sign of trust and honor. "Whatever you face," Jonathan said, "I'll be with you." The two made a covenant of friendship, brothers, not by blood, but by bond. While Saul's jealousy grew, David and Jonathan's friendship deepened like roots beneath a strong tree. But Saul's darkness couldn't be hidden forever. One day, as David played music in the palace, something in Saul snapped. Without warning, he grabbed a spear and hurled it across the room at David. Swish! The weapon struck the wall just inches from David's head. The music stopped. David blinked, startled. But Saul only stared at him, breathing hard, saying nothing. David slipped away silently, confused and shaken. He hadn't fought, hadn't shouted, he just left. But from that day on, he knew Something inside Saul had changed. The palace no longer felt safe. His heart, once a bridge between hearts, now felt like a target on his back. Despite the danger, David stayed loyal. He continued serving the king. He led soldiers into battles and returned victorious. He honored Saul even when it hurt. But behind every mission, every order, he began to feel Saul's eyes watching. Not with pride, but with suspicion. The shadow of jealousy had settled in. And David, for all his courage, now realized sometimes the greatest battles don't happen on battlefields. They happen in the hearts of those we once trusted. The halls of the palace grew colder, though the torches still burned bright. For David, each day began with uncertainty. Would Saul greet him with kindness or raise a spear in rage? Whispers filled the court. Servants and soldiers spoke in low voices. Some said the king was unwell. Others said he was cursed. But one thing was certain. Saul's heart was no longer steady. It burned with suspicion, haunted by a question he couldn't shake. What if David wants my throne? David didn't. He still served with all his heart. He led troops bravely, protected Israel's borders, and brought peace wherever he went. Yet the better he performed, the more dangerous Saul became. Jonathan noticed the change. He saw how his father's mood shifted when David was praised. He saw the tightness in Saul's jaw when songs about David echoed through the streets. He knew something was wrong. So one night, Jonathan met David under the stars where they had once sworn their friendship. "My father is acting strange," Jonathan said quietly. "But I don't think he'll hurt you." David shook his head. "He already tried twice. I've done nothing to him, yet he hates me." Jonathan looked away, torn. "I'll talk to him. I'll find out what's in his heart." David nodded. "If I'm safe, I'll stay. But if not, I'll go." They clasped hands. No matter what happened next, they would protect each other. The next morning, Jonathan sat at the royal table beside Saul. It was the new moon festival, a time when the king's court gathered for a sacred meal. David's seat was empty. Saul said nothing at first. But the next day, when David's chair remained empty, Saul asked, "Where is the son of Jesse?" Jonathan replied carefully, "He asked my permission to visit his family in Bethlehem." Saul's face darkened. His eyes narrowed. You fool," he shouted. "Don't you see? As long as David lives, you will never be king." Jonathan stood, stunned. "But what has he done? Why are you so angry?" Without a word, Saul grabbed his spear and hurled it not at David this time, but at his own son. Jonathan ducked. The spear clanged against the wall. Now, he knew, his father didn't just fear David, he was willing to kill to protect his throne. Jonathan raced from the palace. He went out to the field where David waited, hiding behind a pile of stone. They had agreed on a secret signal. If it was safe to stay, Jonathan would shoot arrows short, but if it wasn't, he would shoot them far. Jonathan raised his bow, took aim, and loosed an arrow that soared deep into the field. David saw it. He knew he had to flee. But before he left, Jonathan met him one last time. The two friends embraced, tears in their eyes. "Go in peace," Jonathan whispered, "for we have sworn friendship in God's name. He will be between us forever." David turned and walked into the hills, his heart heavy. He had lost the home he once knew, the peace of his past, and the safety of the king's court. He had not lost hope, but he had lost everything else. Now he was a fugitive, a hero in hiding, a man hunted for doing right. And yet he still trusted that God was writing his story. The wilderness of Israel was vast, wild, and full of shadows. Caves dotted the rocky hillsides like hollow eyes. Trees rustled with the whispers of wind and watchmen. David ran through it all. He wasn't alone. A few loyal men followed him, outcasts, warriors, shepherds, even men who had debts or broken hearts. They believed in David, not because he promised riches, but because they saw something rare in him, a leader with a gentle spirit and a fierce trust in God. Though he had no palace, no army, and no crown, David began to lead not with fear, but with mercy. His band of men camped in forests and cliffs, hiding from Saul's soldiers who searched day and night to find him. Saul was relentless. The king had allowed jealousy to become rage. Every village was questioned. Every cave searched. Anyone suspected of helping David was punished. One day, David and his men were hiding in a large cave near the desert of En-Gedi. It was cool and dark, water dripping from the stone ceiling. The men were whispering, tired and tense, when suddenly, outside, Saul and a small group of his guards were nearby. Not knowing David was inside, Saul stepped into the very cave where David and his men waited. Alone, David's men tensed, eyes wide. "This is your chance," they whispered. "God has delivered him into your hands. End this now." David crept forward silently. Saul was just feet away, resting, unaware. David drew his dagger butt. Instead of striking Saul, he reached down and carefully cut off a corner of the king's robe. Then he stepped back into the shadows. Even as Saul left the cave, unaware of what had happened, David's heart beat fast, not with pride, but with regret. "I shouldn't have done even that," he whispered. "Saul is still the king, chosen by God." Moments later, David stepped out of the cave. "My lord the king," he shouted. Saul turned, startled. David bowed low. Then he stood, holding up the corner of Saul's robe. "See this," David said. "I could have harmed you, but I didn't. I have never wanted to hurt you. Why do you hunt me like I'm your enemy?" Saul looked down at the missing piece of his robe. His face changed. He suddenly saw the truth. David had shown mercy where he could have taken revenge. Tears welled in Saul's eyes. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me with kindness, though I have treated you with hate. I know now. One day you will be king. Promise me this. When that day comes, spare my family's name." David nodded. "I promise." And with that, Saul returned to his palace. David did not follow. He didn't return to court or reclaim his place beside the throne. He stayed in the wilderness. He knew Saul's heart could change again. The promise was real, but so was the danger. Still, something else had grown that day. David's mercy had become his strength. He was more than a warrior now. He was becoming a leader after God's own heart. And though he wore no crown, the people of Israel began to speak of him differently, not just as the boy who slew a giant, but as the man who spared a king. Years passed. David still lived in the hills, among wild animals, caves, and the quiet songs of the stars. Though he had been chosen by God, though he had been anointed long ago by the prophet Samuel, he waited patiently. He had opportunities to take Saul's life twice, but he refused. He would not take the throne by force. David believed in God's timing, not his own. Saul, meanwhile, was fighting battles of his own, not just against Israel's enemies, but within himself. Fear and jealousy still clung to him. His kingdom, once mighty, was now fraying at the edges. The Philistines returned stronger and more determined. A great battle was coming. One fateful day, King Saul and his 3 sons, including Jonathan, marched into a fierce war against the Philistines. But the battle turned badly. Israel's army was overwhelmed. The hills echoed with the cries of retreat and defeat. Saul was wounded. Jonathan, David's dearest friend, fell in battle. And Saul, wounded, afraid of capture, fell on his own sword. It was the tragic end of a broken king. When news reached David, he tore his clothes and wept. Not just for Saul, who had once loved him, then hunted him, but for Jonathan, the brother of his heart. He sang a song of grief. How the mighty have fallen. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, my brother Jonathan. Your love for me was wonderful. More than the love of women, his tears were not just sorrow, they were honor. Even in death, David refused to rejoice over Saul's fall. He mourned because his heart remained true. After Saul's death, Israel was without a king. Confusion swept the land. But the people remembered David as shepherd, the warrior, the one who had never betrayed his king, the one who had been anointed long ago. They came to him in Hebron and said, "You are our leader. Even while Saul was king, you were the one who led us." And so, at last, David was crowned king of Israel, not in a grand parade or thunderous rebellion, but in humility, surrounded by those who trusted his heart. He ruled not with arrogance, but with compassion. He didn't forget the shepherd fields or the songs under the stars. He remembered Goliath in a moment that began it all. He remembered the friendship that had cost him dearly. And most of all, he remembered God's faithfulness in every step from the pasture to the palace. David's reign would not be perfect. He would face new trials, make mistakes, and fall short at times. But his story, the boy with the sling, the servant who honored his enemies, the friend who stayed true, and the man who waited for God's time, would echo across generations. Not just as Israel's greatest king, but as a symbol of faith, humility, and courage.